In the autumn of 1887, the town of Harwick Crossing, Colorado, held its annual estate liquidation on the first Saturday of October. It was the kind of morning that smelled of frost and dried grass, and the auctioneer, a round man named Purvis Gill, stood on an overturned feed crate with a sweat-ringed hat and a gavel he never stopped tapping against his palm. The crowd was small but purposeful. They had come for a bureau, for 2 mules, for an iron cookstove, with a crack in the firebox that a handyman could patch. They had not come for the trunk. It sat at the back of the yard, against the south fence, under a cottonwood that had dropped its first yellow leaves across the lid. The trunk was old, even by the standards of the things being sold that day. The hide covering was gone in patches, replaced by long stripes of bare wood, darkened by decades of weather. The brass fittings had turned the color of old tea. One Bly hasblock was a style no current locksmith stock parts for a flat spring-ward type with a double throw bolt that had not been manufactured since the mid-1860s. That was the thing Nora felt noticed first. She had been standing near the fence since 7 in the morning, a full hour before Purvis Gill climbed his crate. She was 26 years old, slight and composed, with dark auburn hair pinned in a loose braid at the nape of her neck, a faded red wool shawl pulled close against the October chill. Her boots were practical and worn. She carried a small leather satchel with a brass clasp that matched nothing being sold that day, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, were the tools her father had left her when he died. Martin Felt had been a locksmith for 31 years. He had worked out of a shop on the western edge of Harwick Crossing until the winter of 1885, when a fever took him between 1 week and the next, leaving Nora the shop, the tools, a workbench cleared of every debt. She had kept the shop running for nearly 2 years on her own. Then the building's owner, a man named Croft, who sat on the town council, had found a buyer for the lot and given her 30 days to vacate. The buyer, it turned out, was Croft's son-in-law. Nora had packed the tools, left the workbench, and spent the intervening 6 weeks taking lock work, by commission, out of the back room of the dry goods store, where she slept on a folded wool blanket and saved what little was left after she paid the storekeeper for the space. She had $11.40 in her coat pocket when she arrived at the Harwick Crossing estate sale. She was not looking to buy furniture. She was not looking to buy mules. She had come because of a notice she had read tacked to the post office door, which listed the estate contents of one Elias Vane, deceased, and which included, in small print near the bottom, a listing of miscellaneous trunks and personal effects near the bottom. She was looking at the trunk when Purvis Gill's gavel brought the cookstove bidding to a close. He moved through the bureau quickly, then the mules, then a set of harness straps, then a collection of hand tools. The crowd shifted and murmured and counted out coins. Nora stood by the cottonwood and waited. If you have ever stood at the edge of something that everyone else has already dismissed, you know the particular stillness of that moment. It is not certainty. It is something quieter and harder than certainty. She had not opened the trunk. She had not needed to. Her father had taught her to read a lock the way some men read a face. He paused before he announced it. The pause was brief, but Nora caught it. "Lot 41, he said. "A traveling trunk of indeterminate age. No key lock is seized. Contents unknown. Starting bid is 50 cents. Nobody moved. One man near the fence laughed quietly at nothing in particular. A woman in a gray coat turned back toward the wagons. The frost smell deepened in the air. 50 cents, Purvis Gill repeated. He looked at the trunk. He looked at the crowd. He tapped his gavel. $1, Nora said. Several heads turned. Purvis Gill looked at her with an expression that fell somewhere between surprise and discomfort. He cleared his throat. $1 bid, he said. Do I have $1.50? Silence. Going at $1. He raised the gavel. Miss Felt. His voice dropped. He looked at her directly for the first time. Miss Felt, I would not recommend this lot. The contents are truly unknown. The lock cannot be opened. The estate attorney has been clear that the sale conveys no warranty of contents. You would be purchasing a sealed container. I know what a trunk is, she said. The lock is of an old type. There is no key in the estate. We have no key. I have tools, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Sold, he said. $1. She counted $1 from her coat pocket and handed it to the record keeper at the table. A young man with ink-stained fingers who wrote her name in the ledger without looking up. She received in exchange a slip of paper recording Lot 41, one trunk, contents unknown. Buyer N. Felt, purchase $1. She returned to the trunk and knelt beside it. The brass lock faced her at eye level, which meant whoever had built this trunk had intended it to be used standing. The trunk was taller than most, almost chest height when upright. She pressed her fingers against the hasp and felt the give, or rather the absence of it. The bolt had not merely rusted. It had been driven home deliberately. Something had been wedged into the throw to hold it. Behind her, she heard Purvis Gill's voice drop. That trunk belonged to Elias Vane's father, he said. Not to her. He was speaking to the record keeper. I had instructions from the estate attorney not to put it on the lot. I forgot it in the listing. A pause. She paid a fair price. Nora did not turn around. She laid her hand on the lid and felt the grain of the old wood through the dried hide covering. Whatever was inside had been put there by someone who intended it to stay. She had her father's tools, and she had the rest of the morning. Martin Felt had not been the kind of man who explained his reasons before he demonstrated them. He had shown Nora how a lock worked by letting her hold each piece as he disassembled it, placing each part on the workbench in the order it came out, so that she understood not only what the piece did, but where it lived. He had taught her ward locks and lever locks and tumbler locks, and the old double-throw flat spring types that were already going out of fashion when he learned them from his own father in the 1850 seconds. He had taught her how to feel the give of a bolt under tension, how much pressure to hold and how much to release, when to stop and listen. The hardest thing he had ever taught her, she had decided, was patience. Not the performance of patience, not sitting still, the actual internal quieting of the expectation that the thing should yield immediately. A lock that had been sealed for 20 or 30 years did not know or care that you had been kneeling beside it for 40 minutes. It was a mechanism. It responded to the correct input. The correct input took whatever time it took. She worked through the morning. The crowd dispersed. Purvis Gill packed his crate and his gavel into a wagon and drove back toward the main road without speaking to her again. The record keeper lingered longest, watching her from a distance of about 20 feet with an expression of mild bewilderment, then left as well. By noon, the yard was empty except for Nora and the trunk. She had found, in the first 10 minutes, that the double-throw bolt had indeed been wedged. A thin strip of lead had been pressed into the throw channel, compressing it against the bolt tail. This was not a thing that happened by accident. Someone had chosen to make this lock irremovable without deliberate effort. Her father had shown her lead wedges in the 3rd year of her training, in the context of a locked cash box belonging to a banker who had died without heirs. That cash box had contained nothing of note. The lead wedge in it had been old and oxidized and had crumbled when she worked it free with a pick. This wedge was different. The lead was harder, less oxidized, cut more precisely. It had been placed by someone who knew what they were doing. She worked the wedge free after an hour and a half, using the thinnest pick in the set, and a degree of patience she could not have explained to anyone who had not spent years at a workbench. The lead came out in one piece, undamaged. She held it in her palm and looked at it. Someone had shaped this piece. It was not a scrap. It was a tool, manufactured for the purpose of sealing this lock. With the wedge removed, the bolt moved freely. She applied tension to the hasp, found the spring position, and the lock opened. She did not open the lid immediately. She sat back on her heels and looked at the trunk for a moment. The October light had shifted. The cottonwood had dropped more leaves across the lid while she worked. She brushed them off with her sleeve, and then she opened it. The interior was lined in dark red silk that had dried to a kind of rigid paper over the decades. The silk was intact. Nothing inside had been disturbed by water or by animal. The trunk had been sealed before the weather found it. In the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job for however long it had been, there were 5 items. 4 of them were papers. One of them was a small iron key with a tag of leather, and stamped into the head of the key was the emblem of the Territorial Land Office of Colorado. Nora picked up the papers first. She unfolded the top sheet carefully, because the oilcloth had kept the moisture out, but not entirely the brittleness. The paper was a deed. It was dated September of 1868. It conveyed 160 acres of land in the Gunnison Valley to a man named Soto, given name Aurelio, in exchange for a cash consideration of $200, witnessed by 2 names she did not recognize and certified by a notary whose stamp had faded but whose name she could still read. T. Harwick, Notary Public, Gunnison County. T. Harwick, the name on the county seat, the name on the courthouse, the name that had at some point between 1868 and 1887 become the name of the town in which she was currently kneeling in an empty yard. She set the deed to one side and unfolded the second sheet. It was a second deed, dated 6 months later, in March of 1869, conveying the same 160 acres in the Gunnison Valley. This one transferred ownership from Aurelio Soto to the estate of Calhoun Harwick. The consideration listed was $0. The reason listed was abandonment of claim. She looked at both deeds for a long time. The third sheet was a letter, handwritten in a neat, tight hand, unsigned. It began with a sentence she read 3 times before she moved on. If you are reading this, then I failed to correct what I allowed to happen, and you are a better person than I was. The letter described across 3 pages in the same tight handwriting how Aurelio Soto had been induced to leave his Gunnison Valley land in the late winter of 1869. The writer did not use the word fraud. He used the word arrangement. He described the arrangement in enough detail that fraud was the only word Nora had for it. Aurelio Soto, who had purchased his land legitimately in 1868, had been told by a representative of the county land administration that his deed was improperly filed and that his claim was subject to forfeiture. He had been told this in a language not entirely his own, by a man who had come to his property with official papers. The papers had cited a filing requirement that, the letter writer made clear, did not exist in the actual territorial statute. Soto had left. The land had reverted, through a process the letter described in administrative language that barely concealed its own rot, to the Harwick estate. Calhoun Harwick had been dead for 11 years. His estate had passed to his son, who had passed it to a land-holding company he controlled from an office in Denver. The company's name was familiar to Nora, in the way that names of powerful institutions become familiar in small towns, not through any direct encounter, but through the texture of daily life, through the way people spoke carefully around certain subjects. The fourth sheet was a list of names, 14 of them. Aurelio Soto was the fourth name on the list. 14 names, 14 properties, 14 dates, spanning 9 years. She looked at the iron key with the land office stamp. She set it beside the 4 papers on the lid of the open trunk. She did not move for several minutes. Her father had told her once, in the context of a particularly rusted lock on a freight wagon, that the mechanism did not care about your opinion of the situation. It only cared whether you had applied the correct input in the correct sequence. The sentiment, she had understood even at 14, was broader than locksmiths. She had in her hands a set of documents that corrected a wrong. She also had no particular authority, no legal standing, and about $10 left in her coat pocket after the trunk purchase. What she had, that no one else had, was the contents of a sealed oilcloth in a locked trunk, and the fact that she had bought the trunk for $1 from the estate of the man who had written the letter. If you have ever held a thing that was not yours to sit on and not yours to discard, you know what she felt in that moment. Not triumph. Weight. The particular weight of a thing that has been waiting for the right hand. She refolded the papers and replaced them in the oilcloth. She put the key in her coat pocket next to the $7 that remained of her savings. She closed the trunk and sat beside it on the cold ground for a while, looking at the cottonwood tree and listening to the wind in the remaining leaves. There was a woman named Rosalie Soto who ran a laundry on the edge of Harwick Crossing on the south side of the main road, in a building that also housed a single back room where Rosalie and her daughter lived. Juan Nora knew of Rosalie Soto in the way she knew of the land company, not through direct encounter, but through the texture of the town. She had taken a shirt collar to the laundry once, in the first month after the shop closed, and before she understood how little margin she was living on. Rosalie Soto had returned the collar pressed and clean, with a precise repair of a frayed edge that Nora had not mentioned. She had charged 60 cents. Nora had the trunk loaded onto a borrowed cart by mid-afternoon, using the assistance of a boy she paid 15 cents to help with the carrying. She brought it to the back room of the dry goods store where she had been sleeping. She stowed it under the folded blanket that served as her bed. She thought for a long time. She thought through the night. In the morning she went to the laundry. Rosalie Soto was 49 years old, small and compact, with gray streaks in her dark hair and hands that showed 30 years of hot water and hard work. She was feeding sheets through a hand wringer when Nora came in. She looked up without alarm and without particular welcome, in the manner of a woman who had learned to assess strangers quickly and discard most of them. "I have something that belongs to your family," Nora said. "I think you should see it." Rosalie Soto put down the sheet and looked at Nora for a long moment. "Who are you?" she said. "My name is Nora Felt. I bought a trunk at the Vane estate sale yesterday." The woman's expression did not change immediately. Then something moved across it, not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of a thing that had been expected for a long time and had finally arrived. "Come in," she said. They sat at the small table in the back room. Nora laid the 4 papers and the key on the table between them, in the order she had found them. She did not say anything while Rosalie Soto read. The woman read slowly, moving her lips slightly on the handwritten letter. Her daughter, a girl of about 17 who had been folding pillowcases in the corner, came to stand behind her mother's chair and read over her shoulder. When Rosalie finished the letter, she set it down carefully and looked at the key. "My father left this land," she said. "He told me the story when I was a child. He said a man from the county came and told him the papers were wrong. He believed it. She paused. He believed it because the man had official papers. The papers were not official, Nora said. The filing requirement they cited did not exist. Rosalie looked at her. And now, the letter is dated 1871. The man who wrote it was alive until last month. He left these papers, a locked trunk, in an estate that was just sold. I think he kept them because he intended to do something with them and never did. She paused. The key is from the land office. I know what the key is, Rosalie said. My father described it to me. He said the man from the county had one just like it. He said he watched the man put it in his coat pocket when he left. The silence in the back room was a particular kind, the silence of a thing that has been carried for a long time and set down. The land company controls the property now, Nora said. But a deed from 1868 and a letter describing how it was taken are physical documents. They can be filed. She tapped the key. The land office stamp on this key means it was issued by the Territorial Land Office. The key itself is a record. It may correspond to a lock somewhere in the office's records. It may correspond to a filing cabinet or a document box that was never surrendered when the arrangement was made. Rosalie Soto looked at her for a long time. You opened the trunk, she said. I did. Can you open other locks? Most of them, Nora said. What happened in the weeks that followed was not dramatic, because the truth rarely requires drama to do its work. It requires only to be brought into the room where the relevant people are sitting. Nora wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Denver, citing the deed of 1868 and describing the letter and its contents. She wrote carefully in the plain language her father had always preferred, naming each document and its date and its bearing on the disposition of the Gunnison Valley property. She enclosed a copy of the original deed, which she had made by hand in a careful facsimile. She did not make accusations. She described what the document said and asked whether the office maintained any record corresponding to the key she had found. The reply came in 3 weeks. The land office maintained records of all official keys issued to county agents. The key number stamped into the head of the iron key corresponded to a key issued in February of 1869 to an agent named Leroy Shute, acting as a representative of the Gunnison County Land Administration. Agent Shute had died in 1878. His correspondence had been archived but not reviewed. The office was prepared to review the archived correspondence in light of the deed Nora had described. Would she be willing to correspond further? She wrote back the same afternoon. The process took 4 months. It was not swift and it was not smooth, but it moved, which was the thing that mattered. Nora made 2 trips to Denver, once in November and once in January, carrying the trunk's documents in the oilcloth and a precise handwritten account of each item. On the second trip, she was accompanied by Rosalie Soto, who sat across from 2 land office clerks in a small office on the 2nd floor of the Territorial building and answered their questions with the same compact precision she brought to everything. Daughter stayed in Harwick Crossing to run the laundry. The Harwick Land Company retained a lawyer when the investigation became apparent to them. The lawyer wrote letters. The letters were answered by the land office's own counsel, which was a weight the company's lawyer had not anticipated. The arrangement Leroy Shute had carried out in 1869 on behalf of Calhoun Harwick had left traces in exactly the places the letter writer had described. 2 of the 14 names on the list had heirs who could be located. 4 of the properties had already passed through subsequent sales and were too entangled to reclaim directly. The Gunnison Valley property was not one of the entangled ones. It had been held continuously by the Harwick Land Company since 1869. It was 160 acres of decent grazing land, with a creek on the western edge. In the spring of 1888, following the land office's final determination, title to that land was restored to the estate of Aurelio Soto, deceased, for the benefit of his heirs. The restitution was not everything on the list of 14. It was one name, and that one name represented what the evidence could carry, and the evidence had carried it without a shout or a courtroom scene or a single act of violence. The land company's principals were not prosecuted. What had been done was too long ago, and the law of the territory was not equal to every wrong that had been committed under its name. But the specific wrong documented in the letter, the one that could be traced to a key in a deed in a dead agent's archived correspondence, was corrected. Rosalie Soto's daughter would inherit 160 acres of Colorado land in the Gunnison Valley. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Nora returned to Harwick Crossing in February, after the second Denver trip, and found a letter waiting for her at the post office from a farmer outside of town whose barn had a padlock. He had forgotten the combination to. She answered the letter, fixed the padlock, and charged $1. It was the kind of work her father had done his entire adult life, and she found, in the doing of it, exactly the same quiet satisfaction she had always found in applying the correct input in the correct sequence and feeling the mechanism yield. By spring, she had enough regular work to rent the back of a different building on the western edge of town. Not the same building her father had used, but a similar one, with a window that caught the afternoon light. She set up the workbench herself. She laid the tools out in the order her father had always kept them, each in its place, and she put the oilcloth, with its empty contents, on the shelf above the bench, because it seemed right to keep it somewhere, and because it was hers. If you have ever held a thing the world had finished with and found that it was not finished, you know what kind of morning it was the first day she opened the shop. Rosalie Soto came once in April, carrying a shirt collar for repair. She set it on the workbench and said nothing beyond what was necessary to describe the repair. She did not say thank you. Nora did not expect her to. What had been returned could not be adequately thanked, and both women understood this without discussing it. She left the collar and walked back down the road in the morning light, small and compact against the sky that had gone the particular blue of a Colorado spring that had made up its mind. Her daughter was running the laundry that morning with the competence of someone who had always been capable of it and had only been waiting for the room. Nora watched Rosalie Soto go. Then she turned back to the bench and picked up her father's finest pick, the one he had saved for the old-style locks, and she began to work. The trunk stood in the corner of the new shop, against the south wall under the window. Its lid was open. It held nothing now except the oilcloth and the folded empty papers of what it had once contained. The lock was clean and functional, the bolt moving freely, the spring responsive. She had oiled and tuned it after the vein sale, partly because she could not help herself, and partly because it seemed correct to leave a mechanism in better condition than you found it. The brass fittings still had the color of old tea. The hide covering was still gone in patches. It was, in most lights, a plain and somewhat battered old trunk. She had paid $1 for it. Nobody else had wanted it. Nobody else had known what she knew about the kind of lock on its hasp, or about the kind of person who had built a lock like that and then sealed the bolt with a hand-cut lead wedge and set the whole thing in the back of a yard to wait for the right hand. The right hand had found it in the end. That was the thing about a lock, her father had told her once. It was not a barrier. It was an invitation, addressed specifically to the person who understood what it was asking. She had answered. The mechanism had yielded. Outside the window, the Colorado spring moved across the western ridge in a band of green, that came a little further down the slope each morning, steady and unhurried, the way that things come when they are finally ready to arrive. She did not name it Triumph. She had no word for it that satisfied her, which was perhaps why she kept the oilcloth. The trunk itself she had moved 3 times in the first week after the vein sale. Once from the yard to the borrowed cart, once from the cart to the back room of the dry goods store, once from the dry goods store to the new shop. Each time she moved it, she was aware of its weight, which was considerable, and its age, which was evident in the way the wood had dried and settled and become one thing with itself, in the way that old things do when they have had time enough. The dry goods storekeeper, a man named Aldrich, who charged her 30 cents a week for the back room and rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, had looked at the trunk when she brought it in and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That came from the Vane estate." It did, she said. Purvis Gill tried to pull it from the lot. She had been setting the trunk against the wall and did not turn around. "I know. He was told to pull it," Aldrich said. "By the estate attorney." She turned. Then Aldrich was a lean man with a careful face, the kind of careful that came from having observed things for a long time without comment. He was looking at the trunk. "Who retained the estate attorney?" she said. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask that question for a while and had not been sure the right person would come along. "The land company retained him for the Vane estate work," he said, "same as they retain him for most things around here." She thanked him and said nothing else. She stored the information the way she stored everything else. She did not yet know what to do with, precisely and without opinion, the way her father had stored parts from a disassembled lock on a clean workbench. Aldrich, it turned out, was one of the people who had been watching the Harwick Land Company with that same long, careful attention. He was not the only one. There was a woman named Pete who served on the town water board and had twice questioned the company's claim to water rights on the South Fork of Harwick Creek. There was the Presbyterian minister, a quiet man named Bale, who had done the arithmetic on his congregation's land purchases over a decade and arrived at numbers that did not add up to anything he found comforting. These people had been watching for years without anything sufficient to act on. Nora did not organize them. She did not hold a meeting or give a speech. What she did was share what she had found, with each of them in turn, in the plain language of documents and dates. She laid the papers on the table and let them read. She answered questions when she had answers, and said she did not know when she did not. She was not a lawyer, and she said so. She was a locksmith who had bought a trunk for $1. Aldrich read the list of 14 names twice. He folded it carefully and handed it back to her, and sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "My grandfather is the 7th name on that list." She had not known that. She waited. "He came here from Ohio in 1867, Aldrich said. "He told my father the land was taken from him by a county man who had papers. My father told me. I never had anything to show for it." He paused. 14 names is not one accident." "No," she said. It was Aldrich who wrote a letter to a lawyer in Denver he had known since his own father's time, a retired territorial judge named Crane, who had kept his license and took work that interested him. It was Aldrich who paid Crane's travel costs when Crane came to Harwick Crossing in December to review the documents before the second land office trip. Nora had offered to contribute from the money she had by then begun to save, but Aldrich had shaken his head without making a performance of it. "You found the trunk," he said. "That covers it." Judge Crane was 72, deliberate, and smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. He read the documents at Aldrich's kitchen table while snow came down outside the window, and Aldrich made coffee. He asked Nora several questions, precise and procedural, about the condition of the documents when she found them, the nature of the lock, the lead wedge, the oilcloth. He wrote her answers in a small notebook. "The lead wedge is important," he said. "It establishes deliberate concealment, not passive storage. The person who placed that wedge intended these documents not to be easily recovered. Then why keep them at all?" Aldrich said. Crane looked at his coffee. "That is the question that has no comfortable answer. My experience of men who commit theft at scale is that they sometimes keep evidence of what they did because it gives them the same feeling that the deed itself gave them, a feeling of power over the thing." Evidence of power is a form of power. He paused. Well, the letter writer kept them against the original thief's wishes. We cannot know which. It does not affect the document's legal standing. Nora thought about the letter's handwriting, the tight, neat script, the opening sentence. "If you are reading this, then I failed to correct what I allowed to happen." She did not think it had been Calhoun Harwick who sealed that wedge. She thought it had been someone else, someone who had watched and allowed, and who had meant at some point to undo it, and had not. She had no evidence for this. It was a reading of handwriting, not a legal argument. She kept it to herself. The second Denver trip in January was cold and slow. The train from Harwick Crossing ran twice a week in winter, and the ride was 7 hours on cars that were drafty at the seams. Rosalie Soto sat across from her for most of the journey in a silence that was not unfriendly but was entirely self-contained. She had brought her own food, neatly wrapped, and ate it at noon with the methodical attention she brought to everything. She had dressed carefully for Denver in a dark coat Nora had not seen before, and her hair was pinned with a precision that communicated clearly that she had thought about this meeting and had decided how she intended to appear in it. Nora respected this. She had done the same thing in her own way, wearing the better of her two shawls, the one she saved for situations that required her to be taken seriously, before she had opened her mouth. The land office building was 3 stories, brick, and smelled of dust and sealing wax. The 2 clerks who met with them were formal and courteous and careful in the manner of men who were doing something unprecedented and were aware of it and were going to proceed correctly, regardless. They asked Rosalie Soto questions about her father, about the family's time in Colorado, about the land in the Gunnison Valley. Rosalie answered each question fully and without elaboration. Her voice did not change. Her hands were folded in her lap. At one point, one of the clerks, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses, asked Rosalie whether her father had kept any documentation from his original purchase. Rosalie reached into the bag she had brought and placed on the table a folded paper. It was the receipt her father had been given in September of 1868 when he paid $200 for his land. The ink was faded, and the paper was brittle at the folds, but the writing was legible, and the land office seal in the corner was intact. She had kept it. 40 years, 2 states, 1 laundry business, 1 daughter raised. She had kept a receipt. The clerk with the glasses looked at it for a long moment and said nothing. The older clerk wrote something in his notebook. Outside the window, January Denver moved in cold white light. Nora had not expected the receipt. It changed something in the room, the way a specific thing changes something that a general argument cannot. The deed Nora had found in the trunk was the official record. The receipt Rosalie had kept in whatever place. She kept things that mattered was the human one. Both were necessary. Together they were sufficient. The determination came in March, as the snow was going off the western slopes and the creeks were running full and cold. Nora received a letter at the post office from the land office with a return address she recognized. and she walked directly from the post office to the laundry without going back to the shop first. She handed Rosalie the letter and stood aside while the woman read it. The letter was formal and administrative, the language of official determinations, but inside the language was the thing it said. The claim of Aurelio Soto to 160 acres in the Gunnison Valley, as evidenced by deed dated September 1868, had been found valid. The subsequent transfer of 1869 had been found to have been effected through administrative misrepresentation. The title was restored. Rosalie Soto read the letter twice. She folded it and looked at the window. Her daughter came in from the back room where she had been sorting linen, and Rosalie handed her the letter without speaking. The girl read it. She was 17 and had grown up knowing the shape of what her grandfather had lost without ever knowing whether it could be recovered. She set the letter on the counter carefully, the way she set things she did not want to drop, and she looked out the window at Harwick Crossing, going about its morning business. "What is the land like?" she said. "Not to anyone in particular." "There is a creek on the western edge," Nora said. "The deed describes it. Good grazing." The girl looked at her. Then she went back to the linen without another word, and the sounds of work resumed in the back room, and Rosalie Soto returned to the shirt she had been pressing when Nora arrived. Nora walked back to the shop. She had a padlock waiting on the workbench from a hardware merchant 3 streets over, a simple 5-lever type with a worn spring. Ordinary work, the kind she could do without much attention. She sat down at the bench and picked up her father's tools and set about it. The trunk was still in the corner under the window. The afternoon light came through the glass and lay across the old wood in a long, warm band, picking out the texture of the hide covering where it remained, and the darker strips where it did not. The hasp hung open. The brass fittings caught the light and held it in the particular way of old metal that has been cleaned and oiled and returned to something close to what it had been when it was new. She had paid $1 for a thing nobody else had wanted. She had opened it with tools inherited from a man who had spent his life teaching her to understand mechanisms rather than to force them. Inside, she had found the specific, documentary, undeniable truth of a wrong committed 20 years before she was born, waiting in oilcloth in the bottom of a locked trunk for the person who knew what to do with it. Patience and labor. A learned skill applied to a thing everyone else had dismissed. The mechanism had its own logic, and the logic had its own time. And when the time came, and the correct hand found it, the bolt had moved. That was the work. That was always the work, and she fitted the new spring into the 5-lever padlock and tested the action, feeling each lever seat cleanly in the sequence her father had named for her so many years ago. She could no longer remember a time before she knew them. The lock opened. She tested it again. She set it on the bench beside the small iron key with the land office stamp, which she kept there now as a kind of reminder, and she looked at both of them in the afternoon light and found she had nothing further to say about either.